Evening, everyone. Thank you for coming in for the penultimate evening. We're looking at educating for values, morally grounded politics, and the practice of politics in Deuteronomy. A bit of a mouthful of a title, but there you go. But in our European and North Atlantic world, we are heirs to Athens and Jerusalem when it comes to democracy and politics and citizenship. The ancient Greeks gave us a language and models of practice in relation to democracy and politics and citizenship. And I suppose we might say that the ancient Hebrews gave us significant values to shape and underpin the practice of democracy and politics and citizenship. The Hebrews did not use words like democracy and politics, but they did have ways of organizing power and managing social life and relationships, as well as shaping legal and economic systems. So we have been inspired by Athens and Jerusalem, and we need to be aware of the historical roots of our democratic, social, and political practices and the values that underpin them. As Europeans and North Atlantic peoples, we are who we are because of the Greek humanist tradition and the Judeo-Christian tradition. And as Europeans, we also need to acknowledge the influence of the Islamic tradition. We cannot in many ways understand European culture and identity without the three strands of Greek humanist, Judeo-Christian, and Islamic traditions. All three strands are woven together in our European identity and experience. And it is why I think religious and ethical education in schools and in community education needs to be a critical exploration of those three strands. The Judeo-Christian tradition has been abused and used by authoritarian politicians to justify their strongman politics and to construct a white Christian supremacy. This is also the instrumentalization of a male white God. And we should be critically aware that every vision of God is a proposal for the social organization of society. The God vision has political, economic, and social shape and practice. So when we speak of the Judeo-Christian tradition, we are speaking of a tradition that is primarily Jewish. And Judeo-Christian ought to remind us that Christian tradition has its roots firmly in the Jewish tradition. Christianity in the European and North Atlantic history has denied and or distorted its Jewish roots. We've too often forgotten where we have come from in our faith identity and practice. But over the last 60 or so years, we have been recovering the roots of faith, and that has challenged us to reread the Hebrew Bible and unlearn much of our reading and interpretation of these writings. Judaism itself has at times distorted its own tradition, but there has always been recovery and renewal. And lest we forget the dynamism at the heart of the Jewish tradition, the Jewish people speak of 70 shades of Torah. Now, in Jewish thought and imagination, 70 means unlimited, unending, ever new. There is no one or final or closed interpretation of the Torah, those first 5 all-important books of the Hebrew Bible. There are always new and fresh insights to be discovered, and our Western Christian history has not always been open to that. We might find it odd that an exploration of democracy and politics is looking at the practice of politics in Deuteronomy, the 5th and the last book of the Jewish Torah. In Christian literature, from time to time, there are readings from the book of Deuteronomy, and we need to be aware and remind ourselves that when the Gospels in the Christian Testament are read, the two most frequently quoted and alluded to books of the Hebrew Bible are Deuteronomy and Isaiah. If we're hearing the exact words of Jesus or Mark or Luke's construction of speeches, either way, a lot of time was spent reading Deuteronomy and Isaiah. So for the Jewish people and the early Jesus movement, Deuteronomy was an important source for their social practice. The late Rabbi Jonathan Sacks wrote 5 or 6 books on the Torah, and one book of 386 pages was on Deuteronomy. And I'm drawing on his lively, insightful reading and interpretation of that book. Sacks is very clear, and here is a huge challenge to Western Christianity. Deuteronomy is not a book about the salvation of the soul and the rescue of people from the effects of original sin. That is a key Western Christian reading of the Hebrew Bible. As Sacks says, indeed, there is nothing in the Hebrew Bible about original sin, nor does the idea accord with its theology, according to which we are punished for our own sins and for those of distant ancestors like Adam and Eve. The Jewish people have never read their sacred writings, the Torah, Genesis, or Deuteronomy, in that way. What if Christians have been misreading it? If we have a whole Western theological system to dismantle, a whole theology of fall, redemption to unlearn, and to begin to read the Hebrew Bible all over again. There will be much resistance to that, I expect, from both Catholics and Protestants. So how do Jewish people read Deuteronomy? Deuteronomy is asking people to remember what it felt like to live in a society as a minority without rights and where human beings were a conscripted labor force. That is the starting point for reading Deuteronomy. Of course, it's a religious book, profoundly religious and full of spirituality. But religion and spirituality are only possible in a society. Humans are social beings who live in societies and in social relationships. And if they have any religion and spirituality, it only takes shape and it exists at the heart of our social organization and structures of power and politics and economics and culture. Sacks, again, it is absurd, he said, to suppose that people can reach spiritual heights if they lack the most basic material necessities. And that is why the Exodus narrative is so significant for Jewish imagination and thought, and why it underlies the book of Deuteronomy. The liberated and the good society is a precondition of spirituality. The book of Deuteronomy is a program for a good society. Fundamentally, for Jonathan Sacks, Deuteronomy, quote, is about the creation of a good society based on collective responsibility. Furthermore, the foundation of the good society, a society of the common good, is justice. And when Deuteronomy and the Torah speak of justice, it is not in abstract terms. Justice is concrete practice built into the legal, social, economic, political, and power structures of society. Neither is justice simply procedural, legal, or punitive. In Deuteronomy and Torah, it is about 10% legal or punitive. It is 90% equity or fairness, restorative or distributive justice. That is Deuteronomy's program for the good society. It is about the creation of a moral society with the fundamental moral foundation of social justice, which is the responsibility of all in society. Deuteronomy's program for a good society is based on collective moral responsibility. So we are challenged here with the politics of responsibility. The word that was shorthand for all of this for the Hebrew people was the word covenant. Deuteronomy is about the renewal of covenant for today. Today is a word frequently used in Deuteronomy, as it is in Luke's gospel, because the emphasis is on the contemporary, the now. What does this mean? Not in some past, still less a golden age or a nostalgic golden age, but What does it mean today? Now, in a very real sense, covenant was not a religious idea. Covenant was all around the ancient Near East. It was an agreement between the ruler and people. Covenant was how societal life was organized and how kings ruled and governed their people. So the Hebrews didn't invent the idea. They took it over from the culture and practice around them, but they gave it a new twist. And at an early stage, they believed that God initiated the covenant, a pledged relationship between the sacred and themselves. And here is part of the twist in Deuteronomy. Moses takes the initiative, not God. Deuteronomy has grown up people, humans who fully and freely take responsibility for themselves and the society they want to live in. Deuteronomy breaks out of hierarchical politics. There is no ruler or monarch or ruling political elite making and enforcing laws with an obedient, passive people. This is not a societal vision with power up there, and those who have it rule the rest who are uncritical and unquestioning. When the Hebrews shaped covenant, they broke away from hierarchies and from monarchies and political elitism. Long before the American constitutions, the Hebrews were about we, the people, organizing power and relationships differently, radically differently. And it wasn't just political power they were arranging differently. Covenant was about a radically different arrangement of economic power. We might even say, on the basis not only of a reading of Deuteronomy, but the whole Hebrew Bible, that covenant is an economic vision and program. And Deuteronomy is essentially an economic text. Jonathan Sacks highlights 5 dimensions of covenantal politics rooted in Torah and in Deuteronomy. The first, it is a politics of collective responsibility. In Deuteronomy, the parties to this are everybody in society, the leaders, the elders, officials, children, women, strangers, the woodcutters and the water drawers, the least, in Deuteronomy 19, verses 9 and 10. And that was way, way more inclusive than the American Constitution. 2, it is a politics rooted in the principled equality of the dignity of all citizens. All are in principle equal, all humans equally in the image of God, equal in dignity and worth, and equal as citizens. 3, it is a moral politics. The benchmark of accountability is justice as equity and fairness for all. This is the significance of the voices of the prophets in Hebrew society, those critical voices who spoke truth to hierarchical political and economic power, to unjust systems, and who held up a vision of an alternative, just, and compassionate society. In his famous "I Have a Dream" speech, Martin Luther King said, "We are not satisfied, and we will not be satisfied until justice rolls like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream." And that last quote was from the Hebrew prophet Amos, chapter 5, verse 4. 4th, it is a politics rooted not in power, but in a mutual pledge. A lot of the politics we know is about power, getting power, holding power, and ruling from that power. But politics as a mutual pledge, a commitment by all, inclusively all members of society, all citizens pledge to each other and to the common good. That changes the nature and the practice of politics. And 5th, it is a politics rooted in remembrance and covenantal renewal. We need to remember, wherever we are, we need to remember the politics of injustice, exploitation, oppression, discrimination, exclusion, domination. Name these political failures and abuses and injustices. Move on from them, and together, as we the people build a more just, compassionate, and inclusive society, the good society. And that might mean not only voting every 5 years, but every 5 years publicly renewing our pledge to each other in solidarity and commitment to a just, compassionate, and inclusive common good society. Well, those are the 5 principles, if you like, of politics in the book of Deuteronomy. We go to rooms now. Loretto will allocate those rooms, and we have a couple of questions. That the foundations of a society of common good, the foundation of a society of the common good is justice. What does that mean for our society? And then, and you have notes, I think, to reflect on the 5 dimensions of covenantal politics rooted in Torah and Deuteronomy and their implications for the politics of our society. So a bit of reflection on those 5 dimensions. So have about 20 minutes to toss some of that around and whatever other questions may arise. And then we'll come back after 20 minutes and have a plenary conversation. Enjoy. And as well, yeah, sure. Let's move on for the moment and look at freedom and morally grounded economics. And here we are having a discussion about a more immediate past, but nevertheless, learning from history is always important. And understanding the past and knowing where we've come from is essential, I think, for shaping the present and the future. And as Europeans, we have come out of a history of much brutality and violence and war. But we've also come out of a history of ideas, innovation, the development of democratic political and economic systems, and ways of organizing human life together. It's been a struggle and by no means a smooth journey. As European imperialists, we have dominated the world, destroyed cultures, created a brutal slave trade, and extracted immense wealth from Africa and Asia and South America. The European industrial revolutions brought us much that has made life better, but at the same time has destroyed the planet and brought us to the present eco-crisis. Europe gave birth to the Renaissance, the Reformations, and the Enlightenment, all significant movements that shaped our ways of thinking, our politics, democracy, economics, and cultural and religious values. In 1439, Johannes Gutenberg invented the printing press in Mainz. In 1476, this was brought to England by William Caxton. It was a revolution, and literacy exploded. In 1517, Martin Luther ignited another revolution that was not just religious, but political. It would not have been possible without printing and the humanistic renaissance of thinking from the Greeks and the production of a New Testament in Greek by the great Christian humanist theologian Erasmus of Rotterdam. The Bible was translated into the vernacular. Luther produced a Bible in German. In 1530, William Tyndale translated the Bible into English, and in 1560, the Geneva Bible appeared. The latter had commentary in the margins, and in the translation of the Exodus story and the role of Hebrew midwives in defying the Pharaoh's orders to kill all male Hebrew children, the Geneva Bible margin said, their disobedience to this was lawful. In other words, rebellion and civil disobedience against a tyrannical and unjust king was justified. So the Bible really wasn't a book about the salvation of the soul from original sin. The technological achievement of the printing press had put the Bible into the vernacular and into the hands of the people, and that was incendiary, explosive, and it let loose a political and an economic revolution. People read the Tyndale and Geneva translations, and a group of thinkers emerged called the Christian Hebraists. The Bible in the vernacular helped them to realize the radical power of the Hebrew tradition, and that the Bible was in fact a book about highly charged politics. And this discovery began to shape a new democracy and a new politics. Eric Nelson, a Harvard political philosopher, wrote a book in 2010 entitled, and this is it, The Hebrew Republic, Jewish Sources in the Transformation of European Political Thought. Now, Nelson's book, I think, is essential reading if we are to understand European political thought and the politics of Europe and North America. And Jonathan Sachs was aware of that book by Nelson and helpfully summarizes the three dynamic political thoughts of these Christian Hebraists in the 17th century. They were Republican rather than royalist or monarchist. They read the Hebrew Bible and they realized that ancient Israel's demand for a monarchy, a king, was a complete disaster. And this is why Calvinism and Puritanism are politically Republican and not monarchist. Now, whatever else we may think of Oliver Cromwell, this is where he was coming from when he abolished the monarchy in England and turned it into a republic. Second, at the heart of the Christian Hebraists' biblical politics was the big idea that the government has the task of redistributing wealth from the rich to the poor. The Greeks and the Romans had never thought of that, nor had the politics of Europe until the 16th century. Third, the Christian Hebraists saw that the Hebrew Bible had a separation of powers between the king and the high priest. These 17th century thinkers were well ahead of the 19th and 20th century secular and its separation of church and state. The roots of the secular, they would have said, were in the Hebrew Bible. They used this insight to argue for religious toleration. And that was radical in Europe, or was radical as Europe became mired in a 30 years religious war between Protestants and Catholics that claimed thousands and thousands of lives. But the Christian Hebraists saw in the Hebrew Bible and its separation of powers the principle of religious toleration. Sachs concludes his summary with these words. It was this historic encounter between Christians and the Hebrew Bible in the 17th century that led to the birth of liberty in both England and America. The Calvinists and the Puritans, who led both the English and the American revolutions, were saturated in the politics of the Hebrew Bible, especially the book of Deuteronomy. Now, if Eric Nelson, the Harvard political philosopher, is right, and his book on the Hebrew Republic and how Jewish thought transformed European political thought is both perceptive and pervasive, then our morally grounded politics, or that idea of morally grounded politics, has its roots in the practice of politics being put forward by Deuteronomy. It is worth remembering, I suppose, where we have come from, and even in a much more secular age, to realize the Hebrew Bible and Deuteronomy in particular are the taproot of our best practice of politics. And the heart of all this was the idea of freedom. We have recalled the core paradigm of the Exodus and the role of those Hebrew midwives and their protest action against the oppressive and tyrannical Pharaoh who thought he was God. or God's chosen person on earth. And the Exodus is the story of freedom and liberation from political, economic, military, and cultural oppression. And the Exodus paradigm underlies Deuteronomy. Now, it used to be thought that Moses wrote the book of Deuteronomy, but a 6th century text was not written by a 13th century Moses. As a North American song put it, John Brown's body lies a mouldering in the grave, but his truth goes marching on. Well, Moses' body had been a mouldering somewhere for about 7 centuries before Deuteronomy was written. But his truth, in a sense, goes marching on. And Deuteronomy reworked it for a new today. Out of Egypt, the enslaved came to freedom and to commit themselves to build a society where all are equal and no one group is humiliated or exploited. The truth of Moses marching on was that a just society with human dignity and freedom is the great objective and possibility. The Moses of Deuteronomy says to a people, you are free. The people are free to choose. You can choose good or evil, life or death. And that is not just individual freedom, but the freedom of a nation or a community. Choice, as Sachs has put it, is written into the human condition. The present and the future are in our hands. And this is why in the book of Deuteronomy, the covenantal initiative is not with God, but with the people. They are grown up now, making the grown-up choice for solidarity, equal rights, equal dignity, and together making a free choice to build together a free and just and compassionate, flourishing society. You are free to decide for the future, a different and better future. The other truth of Moses that marches on into our 21st century today is, again, that we are collectively responsible. There are no heroes, elites, monarchs and kings, presidents, or lifelong leaders in Deuteronomy. As the Jewish rabbis put it, all Israelites are responsible for one another. We are collectively responsible for the common good, for the flourishing society, and for the planet. And Sachs again reminds us, this is the origin of the American phrase, which has no counterpart in the vocabulary, he says, of British politics, we the people. Perhaps it doesn't have a counterpart in Irish politics either, north and south. But we may need to be reminded that it was in the political philosophy of Irish Presbyterian Francis Hutcheson, a radical political brew that was said to have been uncorked in America, but which was put back in the bottle and largely thrown away in much of today's American political life. But collective responsibility means a choice for participative and deliberative democracy. It's a choice for active citizenship. Citizens are not born, they are made. We all need to learn to be good citizens, and we choose to be, and to be active and collectively together. It is also why educating for citizenship is crucially important to the school curriculum and the community education curriculum. Deuteronomy is a book about covenant, a pledge collectively, freely chosen by a community or people from we thinking and not I thinking to shape a just and compassionate politics and economics. Deuteronomy is an economic text. Covenant is an economic vision. Or as Richard Horsley put it in his book, Covenant Economics, it's a concern for economic well-being that lies at the heart of the covenant. And again, in a rural and agricultural society, this is why there is much emphasis in the book on the fruit of your ground, livestock, cattle, flock, the basket and the kneading bowl, that sort of imagery. But Deuteronomy is about the economic basis of life together. The covenant has to do with the economic rights of the people. When the Americans, with their limited to male and white we the people, produced a Bill of Rights in the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, they confined those rights to political rights. Economic rights were missing. If we look at the key covenantal texts of the Hebrew Bible, Exodus 20 and Deuteronomy 5, economic rights are central. In the 10 words from Sinai, what we usually call the 10 Commandments, 7, as Horsley has pointed out, 7 of them were fundamental principles of social policy intended to protect people's rights, rights that were basically economic. Freedom has been applied to the market in our world. Free market economy, free trade. It has become a dogma of economics and an extreme unregulated capitalism. There is no doubt that the free market has lifted over 100 million people out of poverty in India and 1 billion in China, described as a transformation unprecedented in history. But, and this is the crucial insight of Deuteronomy, economics need morals. Or as Sachs has put it, without morals, markets cannot function. Markets need morals, and morals are not made by markets. Schools, media, custom, tradition make morals. It's an ongoing process. Religions are also crucial to moral formation, but religion can and does lose its voice. Perhaps inspired by the influence and role of our Hebrew heritage and Deuteronomy in our European history, we can find a public role for religious communities of moral formation and moral values that are social and ecological, and contribute to democracy and politics and economics towards the common good and towards human and eco-flourishing. Well, that's something for the last 10 minutes, maybe. Those Christian Hebraists discovered the politics of the Hebrew Bible and Deuteronomy. What do you think are the implications of their discovery for democratic politics today? When those guys discovered Hebrew language and then discovered the Hebrew Bible, were they onto something? Bit controversial, maybe, because the first thing they were onto was that they were Republican rather than royalist or monarchist.